Let's see. First of all, we're going to have introduction tonight. So let's go around and everybody take a turn to introduce themselves. I'm John DeMaio, K5HTZ. Ken, you go.
I'm Ken, WV0L.
I'm Brewer, W4MGA.
I'm Bruce, W4BRU.
David, Whiskey Delta 3 Oscar.
Ike, W4MAF.
The other page.
I'm Gary, W4GAL.
Armin, WE1UQO.
I'm Steve, W4SB.
John, WB4NHX.
Rick, KA4OHM.
Jack, K4VLG.
Win, W4WIN.
Steve, KX4EF.
Harold, WW4F.
Gary, KJ4IT. I don't. What?
I guess
Who else isn't going?
I'm KJ4WQ, Tom.
Mike, Cam4KXE.
John, KE4THI.
Next person.
I'm Jerry, KJ4IT. Are you copying me now?
Yeah. Who hadn't had a turn yet? Anybody else?
I'm Tom, KD4CMK.
I'll be the second.
PG4BIZ.
I'll be the second Jerry, KO4HFX.
Okay. Anyone else?
N4WLC and
N4JDI.
All right. Did we get everybody? Anybody else hadn't gone yet?
Actually, club member KD4ITR is listening from the other room. It's her birthday and she's going to do something for herself.
Well, happy birthday to her.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
They said happy birthday to you, girl. Uh-oh.
Thank you.
She said thank you.
Okay, anybody else hadn't had a turn to ID yet? Okay, well then let's go ahead and start our meeting. First of all, if there's any corrections to the minutes or anything that need to be made, I'm going to cough through this meeting tonight, I can tell you. Anybody have any corrections to the minutes or anything before we move to accept them? Then let's have a motion to accept the minutes.
So moved.
Okay, somebody second, please.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes accepted. All right, let's move on to treasurer's report. Ken?
Yeah, okay. We started the month out with $13,653.23. We got a whole bunch of dues in, and unfortunately they are separate. $140. Let me get somebody in here a second.
I got it.
$140, $10, $300, $240, $20 donation, $220 dues, and another $20 donation. We sold a power supply for $75. We sold a transceiver for $110. That all added up to $1,000, $1,135. We had to pay for our storage garage, which was $42. I cleared the books for the year since this is the last month of the year in essence, because this is last month. I owed Armin $2.02. So just to clear it completely out for the year, I paid him a check for that. We donated some money to a food bank, $100, and we set up a new website that we can use to make changes to our current one without disrupting everybody. And that cost us $23.99 for the year. So that came through. So we ended up the year, that expenses was $168 and a penny. So we ended up with $14,620.22 for the ending balance of the year.
Not bad.
Not bad.
All right, thank you, Ken.
Okay, I got 2 new members.
Okay.
Gerald B. Sneed II, and I know he's here, I saw him, KO4HFX. He is I'm looking for it, a general. And then we have somebody, Allison P. Andrews, KM4TWH, and a technician. So those are the 2 new people.
Okay.
What's the pleasure of the club?
All in favor of accepting new members?
Aye.
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 Okay. Anybody opposed? Okay, they are accepted. We probably will have a few more coming in tomorrow because we have testing going on. We had a very large, I'll let Bruce report on this, but we had a very, very large class of technicians this time, and a bunch of them are going down for testing tomorrow, plus some of the generals and the extras, I think, too. So we should have some new members coming in. I'm going to try to keep my talking to a minimum tonight. I apologize for the cough. It's not COVID. They took me off of one of my medicines, and because I was swelling from it, and I'm coughing now. So bear with me. I'm going to turn it over for a second to Mike Friedman. He had an idea about one of the things that we have on our website is a repeater page. Gives you a listing of the repeaters. It's kind of out of date. It gets out of date periodically. Mike had an idea that he might want to try to do something to help us on that. So Mike, can you tell us about it?
All I had pointed out, and I've been thinking this for a while, is I use the repeater portion of the web page as a resource. I share it with people. I use it myself quite often, and it really could go for being updated. And we know that's always a constant problem. And I got to thinking, how can we make this something easy to update on the website while maintaining our sanity in doing that? And so I finally decided I'll do it myself, hopefully put together a group. I'd love to vet this with the club and love to have some volunteers help me with creating this. But my vision is to have the web. I love right now how you go to it and it's right there front and center. So you can send anyone new or anyone just new to the area, send them to the website, they see it front and center. I'd love to enhance it. Love to leave notes. Actually, I just want to enhance it, update it, and make it easier to maintain. So when there is a new repeater, or maybe unfortunately a repeater disappears, it'll be easy to update and propagate to the website. So after seeing Ken's KML file, which I love, and that I'm going to use as a resource. If you haven't checked it out on the website, do so. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Ken?
Well, that goes back to when I first joined. I didn't know anybody. I didn't take any classes. I was self-taught. And I wanted to know, where are all these hams at? And so that sparked me to try to figure that out and get data out of the FCC and whatnot. It's progressed to this point that I download the entire FCC database for the whole United States. I pull everybody out that's in Virginia and geo-encode them so that I know where they are, or at least more or less where they are based on their address. And then I maintain a database on my machine of all of that.
Yeah.
And so I sort of knew where everybody was. And then Google Earth has the ability to allow you to create something called a KML. No.
Yep, KML.
Yeah. Keyhole Markup Language, KML file. And if you compress it, it becomes KMZ, which is what's out on the website. But I drop a little point or a little sticker or a little teardrop sort of thing where everybody is in our club, the 6
I got him.
Club, and the FM 17 grid on the map. So I have all of that, and I made it available to everybody. Inside the little teardrop will be a letter which has what your license is. So if you're an extra, it's an E. If you're a general, it's a G. If you're a technician, it's T. If it's blank, it's a club. You could have a novice still out there. You could have an advanced, so an N or an A. So that's what I put out there. And then I recently added, I go to repeaters.com and I pull all the 2 meter and 70 centimeter repeaters in the state of Virginia and put those up. Somebody complained that the locations are not quite accurate, and whoever put it on repeaters.com is the person who messed that up.
Yeah, so actually I noted that myself, but you know what? You're like maybe 6, 7, 800 feet off. It doesn't matter. It's in the general area.
Oh, yeah.
And that was my point, is what my vision is, and if I have some help with this, I'd love to expand it greater than what we have. If you go and look on the RARC site right now, you will see a 2017 document that it's very helpful. It gives you all the repeaters. It gives you the PL tone and the type of function that repeater has. I want to do that plus a little more. And if I have more help, we can break it down to regions. I mean, the sky's the limit. I mean, we'll definitely cover Richmond. I'm a fan of repeaters outside of Richmond that you can pick up. And if we have some help, I'm going to use Ken's resource there because, you know, that's going to be very helpful. I can break it down to the county at that point. So my vision is to update it and make it so that we can always keep it up to date. I'd be a stickler for that. If I can work with the new website and the webmaster helping with that. So that's pretty much it. I look for anyone's input, and I'd love to vet this with the club just to make sure we haven't made any mistakes. David WD3O can chime in on this. One of the clubs out in the valley, they do this as well, and they ran it past the club for clarification, and I plan to do the same. So if you guys are up for it, I'd even take some volunteers.
Okay, somebody has a microphone open. It's causing feedback. If y'all would mute your microphones if you're not actively speaking. I'm hearing, it sounds like a washing machine in the background. Okay, Mike, I think this is a great idea. Bruce is basically the one who's in charge of the website, and Ken is working with him right now to program and test this new website. If you would, Ken and Mike, if you all would agree to get together and share ideas on this, and Mike, I think you could probably go ahead and build it in to what Ken's doing now.
Great.
Ken, is that okay with you?
Sure. Yes.
Okay, good. I'll leave you two to coordinate and calculate and see what you can come up
We've
with.
done this sort of thing before with the calendar. It's
Yeah.
an external calendar that we connect to the website, so that's quite doable.
Okay, great. All right. We'll go ahead and ask for reports then for tonight. Bruce, do you want to report on the school?
We have some people are going to be taking their exams tomorrow. We actually have one more class for those that want to. And I've got some students from outside Virginia that Zoom is allowing us to do. So they're certainly going to be sitting through the last class. But so we're coming to the end of that. One of the things we've had a discussion about is how to follow what the Nashua and New Hampshire Club is doing with the boot camp for people who are either new hams or new to upgrade, such as particularly from tech to general, where you got to learn HF. So we're working on that. Tomorrow, those of us who are working on that are going to do an experimental thing in which we'll use the club's remote control radio to figure out how we can get people to go on HF and get by the mic fright. And that radio also does UHF, VHF. So we think we could use that with Zoom as a way of getting people kind of on the air, making the first QSO. So we'll experiment with that tomorrow and try that. The other thing we're looking for is a source of relatively inexpensive used HF radios. A lot of the new general operators are young enough, they don't have a whole lot of money, and we need to see if we can help them find some inexpensive radios. The 7300 has basically dropped the price, the value of quality radios down, so we should be able to find some used ones out there. But if you know any sources of used radios where Ham could put something together for HF for $500, $600, $700, that let us know, and we'll work on that. You can probably easiest to let John know, but that's what we're working on. So those are our current projects that have to do with students and new hams.
All right, thanks, Bruce. We do, by the way, have another offer of some equipment. I have to go look and see what the person has. This is another silent key. Apparently, it's passed away 2 years ago, and the family's just getting around to sorting through their equipment and deciding what to do with it. So the lady told me she has not only some equipment, but she has all her father's QSL cards and old logs and historical information. So we're going to pick through all that and see if any of it pertains to us and to Virginia, and possibly go ahead and put some of it in our little archive that we have over there in the storage vault. You never know when some of that information may come up handy in research in the years to come. I assume everybody's heard about the YouTube video that the governor did today, where they now have clamped us down again to nobody meeting more than 25 people at a time. So I was going to suggest that we, before I heard about it, was going to suggest that there was a possibility that maybe we wanted to consider temporarily holding our meeting somewhere in person, since RATS was doing it. My fear was that even though this is a good group and hangs together, that the camaraderie we had, when we met in person is kind of being lost. And so I was thinking maybe we wanted to establish a temporary meeting place, but this kind of puts a crimp on that. So I guess we'll have to see where it goes from here. If it comes to the point where we can meet in person and there's enough people interested in doing that, excuse me, we could look for a temporary meeting location. So if that's something that's an open idea. If anybody has any ideas about it or wants to do anything about it. Okay, any other reports for tonight? All right, anybody have any business that they want to bring up? Anything? New business, old business? Yeah, Ken?
Our Radio Builders Group will meet this next week Tuesday, and I'll send out a invitation to everybody in the group on this weekend.
Okay, great.
If you're interested, if you've not been involved in this group and you are interested, send me an email at k4zut.ham, and that's at gmail.com, and I'll put you on our mailing list.
Okay, thanks.
Thank
By the
you.
way, Ken, I have your radio. I'll bring back to you. Try to bring it back over the weekend. Okay.
No rush. No rush.
I'm copying it right now. I'm building Bruce's and copying yours. So, okay. Anyway, I'll get it.
It'd be nice to get a number of them working. I think Rick, WA4OHM, he had his working, but I think he blew the final out. I'm not sure if he was able to repair that or get that going. But I think that in Gene, his was working, but we haven't had a very good success rate for all those kits.
I'm convinced mine had a bad part, and I haven't identified what it was yet. Because when I held mine side by side with yours, it was exactly identical. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking we just had a bad part.
I do have some unbuilt kits that have parts. So if you can identify a bad part, we probably got a replacement for it in the inventory that I have.
Okay. Well, let me say that when I plug Ken loaned me his radio to test side by side with mine, because mine appeared to be transmitting and you could pick it up on a receiver, but it was only drawing 160 mils of current. So I borrowed Ken's. He put it on the same power supply and the same system and same antenna, and it was drawing 345 mils. And on the second CQ that it called, I got a contact in from New York. So Ken's radio is working, which means that the kits are capable of working. It's just a question of, whether there's some of the kits had a bad part in them or something. So we'll run all that down.
This is the D4D,
Yeah.
which was a FT. Is it an FT8?
FT8, yeah.
FT8 radio.
I mean, it seems to work. When it works, it works very well.
You mean I built something that actually worked for once?
Oh yeah,
huh?
absolutely. Okay, so thanks for that report. Let me admit this person. Oh, you got it. Okay, thanks for the report on the builders group and everything. I think that's a good thing that we want to keep going. Okay, anybody else have anything then?
Let me just make one comment real quick.
Sure.
Half of you have paid your dues. We'll put it that way. It's the best way to put it. So half of the club has paid their dues already. So I'm going to send out a note probably after this meeting to the rest that haven't and request them to pay their dues.
Okay. Ken, let me mention too, you might want to chime in on this. There are some unclear points in the bylaws that Ken and others have brought up. For example, the situation with members that are reaching 80 years of age during, Ken, explain what's going on with that.
Well, that particular thing is not actually in the bylaws. It's something that the board decides. But the 80-year-old, the gist of what everybody's been sort of told is when you're 80, you don't have to pay your dues anymore. And the best way to say it is after you turn 80, you don't have to pay your dues. So when the dues come due, if you're 80 years old at that moment, then you don't have to pay them. If, let's say right now you're 79, that's when the dues are due first of this month. But you turn 80 in February, you're still supposed to pay your dues. And I have a little thing that I do a calculation and basically since I asked everybody what their birth year is, I can automatically switch you over and I won't ask you to pay your dues when you magically make that thing. But I assume you were born in January the 1st of the year you were born. The only thing that in the way I do it comes out is if you were born in November or December, and we'll say November 2nd on for the rest of the year, you sort of get the benefit of being born in January the 1st because you actually won't be 80 by my calculations. I mean, by my calculations, you will be, but you actually aren't. But just because we start the year in November, our physical year. The bylaw changes that I'm proposing is several things. The main thing boiled down to the controversy or the inconsistencies in whether or not board members can serve more than 2 terms or how that all works. It turns out in the bylaws, there's a term defined or term that is used that's not defined. And so my changes basically are to define all the terms that are used in the bylaws and to put a 2-year term limit or 2 consecutive term limit on all officers other than the treasurer. And the treasurer, I put an idea out of 5 years and the board's going to talk about it, and then we're going to come up with it. And of course, the club has to approve it. But my only reason for the treasurer is not because I want to do the job for 5 years, but because the bank accounts, and you have to change that, and then we get a debit card, and that's got to get all changed. And so to do that every 2 years is a little bit of a pain. The other thing I threw in is we have, and most people don't know it, we have full-time members or full members, which is all of you who paid your dues. We have inactive members who are people who used to be members but didn't pay their dues. And the bylaws do not say how long you get to stay in the inactive membership log. So I have that maintained, and I'd like to change that to say, after you've been in there for 10 years, we're going to just sort of drop you out and not remember that you ever were a member of the club. It's just a lot of data to retain for a long period of time. And so I'd like to put a term limit on how long that data is retained. Let's see if there's anything else that I added. Oh, there's a funky way the definition of who's on the board is done. And I clarified it. And the clarification really is there's elected officers, there's appointed officers, and things of that nature. And to help make it clearer, the current says the past president is on the board, and then the current president gets to appoint somebody to the board. And I changed it to say the current president appoints 2 people to the board, one of which must be the past president. So it comes out the same, but it's the definition of appointed members, elected members, and things of that nature. And then the officers of the club, the president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. So, and then there's the, what is it called? What's Matt called?
The trustee.
The trustee. The trustee is always on the board, and the board decides who the trustee is every year. But that person stays on the board. So there's the categories, and I'm trying to just clarify it. For most people, it's a nit, other than to say that we will definitely put term limits on the officers, just so we get the turnover in the club. The club doesn't, take a stale direction, if you will. The old was said 2 years, but it was, as I say, worded extremely funny. When you can talk about it, I saw you come in, but it's that type of thing, just to clarify how that all rolls around.
When did you want to say anything on it?
Unmute here. No, I think some clarification is in order, just to make it easier to understand. And I appreciate Ken, delving into that. It's thankless work. Try to make those revisions. But I think everybody, when they see the finished product, will agree what we're trying to do is just to make things clearer, not to really make any huge changes in the governance of the club. It's worked well for years, but we have had situations come up where we looked to the bylaws and to get an answer, and we weren't totally sure, so we had to make our best effort to interpret them. And it's probably been at least 10 years since they were amended, and I think it's time for an update. And we can address, if we want to, if the membership does. Again, this is a membership decision. We can address situations like, how do we hold elections when we can't meet, and make that very specific. Whereas in the past, we've had to sort of interpret what our options were. So I appreciate Ken's taking the time to work through that, and I'm sure everybody will get a chance to review a draft and make comments and then vote on it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Wayne. Ken, you have anything else?
No, as I say, right now, I've sent it out to the board. The board's going to look at it. We're going to have a board meeting. Board will make changes or approve it, whichever it might be. And then by the bylaws, we have to tell the membership at least 14 days before a meeting that we're going to do this. And of course, I will send a copy to every member that here are the bylaws with the proposed revisions. The way I have it right now that I'm set to the board, I have highlighted the new stuff. And if you've ever seen a legal document or something where they're taking something out, they put a line through the text. Well, there's a font that will do that. And so there's line through items and then the words, so you can sort of look at what was there and what the additions are and see it in context. So that
Yeah, I'll be polling the board sometime in the next week or so to try to get a date when we can all meet by Zoom and have a board meeting, because we do for one anyway.
So that's as I say, it's something that I'm proposing that we make a change to. If anybody right now has any ideas, the term limits, if you think treasurer for 5 years is too short, too long, speak up and let us know so that we can make the change. As I say, I pulled the number out of the air, so.
Well, suppose we say anybody that has any ideas or corrections or anything that they picked up on, go ahead and email Ken and let him know. And Ken, you kind of coordinate it, and then we'll get together with the board.
Sure will.
Okay. Let's see. I think that's all of the. Unless anybody else has any reports of business tonight, we could go ahead on to our program. Does anybody have anything before we? Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I saw a message that went out to everyone from Jim, KK4IUH. Many of you may know that last week was the last week that his area, the District 6 Aries, was on the RATS repeater. It is now called District 1 Aries. The net is Thursdays at 7 p.m. on the MRA repeater, 145.430. And that listing just needs to be updated. That was his request, wherever it might propagate on the web. So figured I'd throw that out.
Mike, are you comfortable speaking about what's going on with 88? Because I noticed nobody's on it anymore. Is it all digital now, or what?
No, it's not. I think going back to last week when Jim was on, I've heard a few people mention that, when you try to key up, it's that multi-use DMR and analog. So a lot of times there will be someone who goes on, and I think a lot of people, they keep quiet, but it seems.
Hey, John, can you copy me?
Yeah, Joe.
Okay. I'll tell you about that.
Okay.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah. Take it, Joe.
There's, to speak very bluntly, there's quite a lot of turmoil going on within the club. I'll just say that. And part of that turmoil is the dissolution of the original agreement as far as the Aries use of the computers as the repeater is concerned. So with that being said, with the dissolution, RATS has asked Aries to refrain from using the repeater for the club district net, and subsequently 4-3 peddling boys over there said, that's okay, come on back and use the 4-3 for your nets. The fact that talked about the district situation several months ago, as we had meetings with VDEM, we were, put it bluntly, sort of back into good graces of VDEM, mainly because of changes within the VDEM employees. With that being said, it was decided that Aries was going to change their geographical map coverage identification so that it would be matching the VDEM districts, 7 districts within the state of Virginia. And that's the reason it is now District 1 instead of District 6. So we did away with the 15 districts. We pared them down to match the geographical map of VDEM so that we could be, let's just say, more cooperative. And when we're talking about things and doing things and practicing and whatever, it falls directly in line with VDEM. So that's the, the story behind the story. As far as things going on, it was no quite solicitation to bring on the digital repeater. It was subsequently done sort of overnight with this combination situation. And a number of people are quite upset with the fact that, of course, because it's DMR and analog, you cannot hold simultaneous conversations. It's one or the other. And of course, when DMR is on, if you do not have a squelch or private line, if you will, on the analog side, you get the ungodly buzzing sound out of it, and subsequently, it that annoys a lot of people because a lot of people leave, don't use the private line on the receive side, so they can even hear, Raleigh or other places. So right now, it's rats is rats, and they're going to do whatever they ends up doing. I don't know what it is. I'm not involved in it. I have stayed away by 50 feet. And like I said, people are not on it as much as they were because of that combination situation. So ultimately, what is going to be resolved, I do not know, and I am not going to make a guess.
I hear you, Joe. Thanks a lot for the report. We appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Sorry, my camera, I don't know. It's had its mind of its own right now. So.
Okay. Thank you.
And thank you for everything you've been doing to help there. If you all got my newsletter for the 2 months, you probably found out I had some medical problems, and we're working through them at the present time.
All right. Well, we wish you good luck on that, Joe.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody else have anything for the meeting before we go on to our program?
John?
Yeah. Speak up, who?
John?
Yeah, Ken.
I was just wondering, I came in kind of late. Do we have any new license upgrades this time or guests today?
Well, I'm a guest.
We probably will have after tomorrow, Ken.
Do we have any new license upgrades?
Apparently not.
Oh, okay.
That should change next time, though. I know at least 3 people who joined in the club, so, and they hopefully they'll all get their licenses tomorrow.
I
Okay.
just got upgraded. If it.
Oh, you upgraded? Okay.
Yes, sir, and joined the club at the same time. I took the test last weekend with the other group, and they apparently everything was delayed. Everything was posted today. I got a copy of my license today.
What you call?
KO4 HFX, Jerry
Okay.
Sneed.
Welcome. We're glad to
I
have
know
you.
there was a handful of technicians and a few generals. I don't know if there were any extras that got it last weekend, but I know there was a group of probably 12, 15 people took the exams.
Okay.
Can I address that?
Sure.
All right. So KC4TS amateur radio team, we gave exams this past Saturday in Powhatan.
Right.
We had 5 earn their technician license. We had 2 go to general. And things were delayed. They should have updated this past Tuesday, but FCC Gettysburg has not updated since the previous Monday. So those that just tested this past Saturday were up, finally went into the database today. I know they've got Alan's group has got exams tomorrow. We will also be giving exams in December the 5th in Powhatan. So if anybody is interested, just go to the ARRL website, look under exams, and they can get all the information. We're also going to plan to do exams January the 2nd if we all live through January the 1st.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Question real quick. Gerald, you're a general now?
Yes, sir. I got my tech in September and then went on and upgraded here last week. So I'm a general now.
I'm going to update you in the roster just to make sure.
Thank you, sir.
All right. So Tonight we have a special presentation. Brewer's going to tell us about some stuff with the new what is it?
5G.
5G. So let me go ahead and turn it over to you then.
All right, gentlemen. It's my pleasure. I got to start with a warning. This is deep. This is very deep. This is way too complicated to absorb in 45 minutes. So we're going to go for buzzwords and commentary about what 5G might mean to you as a cell phone user. Very complicated, and I'll be glad to come back and do another session about this, at a later date, because there's no way we're going to get any depth or any uptake in this particular event tonight. So I'm going to pull up a bunch of different things. I'm going to share my number one screen, and hopefully you guys will see that, and somebody tell me when you do.
Yes.
You see a PowerPoint in normal mode?
Yes.
Good. Okay.
Well, no, we see it with the menu items on the side.
Well, that's called normal mode.
Oh, okay.
Presentation mode is full screen, but we're not going to do that because I got to navigate this paper. There's hundreds of slides in all these papers, so I got to be able to punch around. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay. All right, here we go. This is a paper I did about 2 years ago. We're going to take a look at 5G. We're going to have to go backwards to understand what 5G hopes to do. Statement about, what's coming here in this coming year. So since 2015, which was about 5 years into the 4G launch, 4G started with 2010. We've had 11x growth in the user space. 70% of all mobile data traffic will be from videos, people streaming videos on their handsets or using their handsets as a source streaming device to their larger panel in the house. But at any rate, large amounts of video data, and we all know video eats up the data. 90% of the mobile data traffic will be from smartphones, not any other kind of phone. 85% of all subscriptions will be for mobile broadband service. So most of us are on these open plans, no limits on your gigabits. I say most of us. If you've got kids, they want no limits. So the concept of paying $3 a minute like we used to back in the 1G days in the 80s, those are gone. The concept of paying for a 1 gig or 2 gigabyte per month, those days are pretty much gone, even for the cheap services. And then most notably, what 5G is doing to what 4G had already done is they're projecting 28 billion devices connected to the network next year. That's 28 billion, not million. We got what, 7 or 8 billion human beings on the planet. So not only does everybody and his dog have a cell phone, but you've got them in the refrigerators and the lawnmowers, in the cars. Something else you've probably seen recently is all these low Earth orbit satellite constellations that Elon Musk and Bezos are putting up. Those are going to essentially provide non-terrestrial service for, leveraging some 5G technologies. It won't be strictly 5G. So the problem of not being able to get some reasonable internet speed anywhere on the face of the earth is going to go away. They've literally littered the low Earth orbits. I don't know how they get a moonshot or a rocket shot up anymore without hitting one of these things, because they're deploying thousands of them. So in a lot of ways, 5G is a fundamental part of what's going to happen on those satellites. 5G is not just one thing. Well, let's move forward here. So this is a presentation showing the 2G, 2.5G, all the way up through 5G. Might as well say it, 6G is already on the drawing board. 0G was us back there with narrowband FM. 1G started about 1980 with the Motorola brick phones. Those were not much more than 800 megahertz two-way radios with a control channel that coordinated the handoffs and the connection back to the circuit switch telephone network. That lasted for about 5 years before 2G came along. And that had various forms here in the United States. It was called IS-136. And it was a digitally modulated time-divided carrier system. You had a similar one called GSM in Europe, and that still survives a little bit today, but it's going away. And then also around those times, the Qualcomm company started by two mathematicians from the Bell Labs, Viterbi and Jacobs. And they came up with this thing called code division multiple access. And that was basically spread spectrum by the use of orthogonal codes. And the orthogonal code was how you kept your bits segregated from somebody else's bits. Suffice to say, at 2G, everything had moved over to vocoded speech or vocoded traffic, whatever it may be. Analog disappeared with 1G. All right, no time to cover all of this, but essentially there was a contest across the planet for who was going to dominate the standards. Here in the United States, we had ANSI and the IEEE. In Europe, they had ETSI. In Japan and Asia, they had Docomo. And China had their own thing going. Somewhere around 2000, Y2K, 3G became what they were calling it. There was a version, two versions of wideband CDMA. There was a time-divided CDMA in China. There was evolved GPRS Edge, which was a GSM. And there was the evolved CDMA 2000, that again was a Qualcomm standard. So at that juncture, around Y2K, a couple of critical things happened. They decided to stop fighting over who had the standards. They formed this thing called the 3GPP, the Third Generation Partnership Project. They absorbed from ETSI all those documents and quite a bit of what was in the ANSI and IEEE documents to create this thing called wideband CDMA. That's that first thing over here in this column. 3GPP survives today because they didn't want to keep changing the name of all the business cards and everything. So if you want more information, 3gpp.org is the treasure chest. It's very, very deep. And as we'll see later, these standards are never finished. They're moving targets. They have releases. The releases are always being, released for, okay, let's try this. And here's what we're going to do next year. We're going to go back and clean up what we did last year and 5 years ago. So there's not one thing. It's the most dense body of standards I've ever seen. And I rarely go in there because it's too much for me. All right, then you see the evolution of 2G, 3.5G, 3.9G, and 4G. And eventually around 3.9 or 4G is when they started calling it LTE, long-term evolution. And that was essentially to get away from the physical layer modulations of these other standards. So code division went away, time division went away, various forms of GSM. They all kind of said, okay, we did all we could do with that. Let's move into something more attractive, more compatible with the mobile environment, more compatible with the broadband environment. And that is where, say 3.9 and 4G is where we all move to something called orthogonal frequency division multiple access. And we'll talk about that later, but AM's gone, FM's gone, time division's gone, code division's gone. Even though there is some time division within the frame timing of OFDM, OFDM is the holy grail, and I don't see that changing no matter what we do from here on forward. We're tweaking it around the edges, but the basic concept stays the same. Anybody lost yet? Okay. Notably, over here on this right-hand side, you see this wideband LAN, 802.11. That's your Wi-Fi. So one of the things that bugged cellular all these years and still is that Wi-Fi delivered more data rates for cheaper dollars, $50 at Walmart, than cellular could ever do. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that cellular, up until very recently, was macro cellular, large cells. So like our repeaters today, we love our wide area repeaters because they cover a wide geographic area, but we pretty much defeat ourselves on the last domain of exploitation, and that's space division. So cellular meant and still means taking the geography and breaking it down into cells, smaller and smaller and smaller cells. And that's where we get more reuse of the frequency and time domains for whatever purposes. So having said that, Wi-Fi is still here. You see this down here at the bottom, 802.11ax and AY. Those are the evolutions of what's very common, 802.11ac and AD. 802.11ad is 10 years old, never got any market traction, but it was a 60 gigahertz physical layer that would do all the stuff they're trying to do in 5G, but it never got standardized, put in the chipsets and put in the laptops, so it's languishing, let's say. And it was the opportunity that the cellular services decided, hey, we're gonna have to go to millimeter because we have already eaten up all the television spectrum and everything else, and they will try to eat up the 400 megahertz band. They've already eaten up most everything else. It's hard to stop them. So they've moved to millimeter, and currently the millimeter is kind of focused at 28 gigahertz, 39 gigahertz. You'll hear there's something called frequency range 2 in the 5G vernacular. That means anything from about 22 gigahertz to 52 gigahertz. However, they've recently pushed it to 70 some gigahertz. And what they're gonna call 6G is gonna go up to 330 gigahertz, just way up there. I don't know how they're gonna put that in the phone and get any battery life, but that's their problem. All right, any questions here before I jump off this standards chart? Okay, lost you all already. Here we go. So LTE 4G, it did a great job. I will say when 4G LTE hit the market in 2010, they had the data thing fixed. All of a sudden you could get a lot of megabits per second in your phone or through your phone, but they forgot to implement the text and they forgot to implement the voice phone call. Uh-oh. So they came up with something called voice over LTE, which is just a voice over IP service. They went back and emulated the text, which really got started in 2G GSM, and kept everybody happy long enough to make it real, so to speak, so that the user really didn't know. A lot of those phones back 10 years ago were multi-standard. They could do 2G, 3G, and some early 4G. But the fact is now all the big providers, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, they're all basically abandoning their 3G, 4G technologies and moving into 5G, with the caveat that right now 5G is really anchored in a 4G call setup. But when it comes time to start streaming huge data streams, they might do that at a higher frequency, like at a millimeter wave band, if it's available. But in general, everybody's calling these phones 5G, and then the chipsets will do it. The firmware in those phones may or may not do it. That's all changeable when you update your iPhone or update your Samsung. So they're not fixed. And in general, Qualcomm owns most of this market. There's a thing called a Snapdragon chipset, several different versions of it, some more exotic than others. They're made by Qualcomm, and they will do 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, although, you know, they're not programmed to do 2G and 3G much anymore. I wanted to back up a little bit and talk about this thing called OFDM, which I'm going to have to dogleg off to here as a fundamental in a second. OFDM's been around for a long time. Conceptually, like CDMA, it existed mathematically way before they had the technology to make it. So I've always found it very curious that a lot of the fundamental papers on this stuff was written in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, way before we had microprocessors or any of the chip density that it takes to do it. And OFDM was the fundamental for the digital video, audio, and television over in Europe. And back when the United States was trying to figure out what it was going to do and eventually went the wrong way with 8 VSB, digital television over there was done with OFDM. And we'll see why OFDM is attractive compared to other modulation schemes. So if you look at this slide, the path to 5G, we have releases 10, actually LTE 4G started with release 8, but you see this release 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. There's actually a lot of work in release 17 now. These are kind of breakpoints when the 3GPP, and it's a huge congress of thousands of companies and people, work these standards up to a point and they say, okay, we're going to set a flag. This is what you're going to build against until further notice. And we are currently definitely into the release 15, release 16 era now. Release 17 is picking up what people might call 6G. All right, a couple of more. This is kind of buzzwordy stuff. LTE versus NR, which means new radio. New radio synonymous with 5G. Most everything we've done here recent decades has been sub 6 gigahertz. You've got the 2.4 gig ISM band, the 5.8 gig ISM band where the Wi-Fi sits. There's also been some LTE encroachment up there, but in general, the sub 6 band is called FR1, frequency range 1, is a macroscopic term, and it is existing with a lot of other services, including our ham bands. You know, anything under sub 6, there's a lot of ham bands in there, and we just saw they harvested the 600 megahertz band. They love this lower stuff, 400, 500, 600 megahertz, because they can still get a reasonable antenna, and the signal propagates real well through sheetrock. The free space path loss is not so bad. When you get up to millimeter wave, like 20, 30 gigahertz, that stuff is even shorter range than Wi-Fi. It goes 60 feet and it's gone. You can build a big old, 10-foot dish to try to get it back, but that's not an attractive proposition. So the access points, what you'd look at is a Wi-Fi router that will do this 5G stuff at FR2, something in a reasonable footprint. They're good for shooting around the basement. And as it turns out, they actually literally have to scan around, beamform, beam scan to find anybody else to talk to. It's not kind of like sectorized in the cellular systems on the macroscopic sense, where the cell size could be 1 kilometer, 6 kilometers, 30 kilometers, 50 kilometers. So this other region up here, everybody still there? Something just disappeared on my screen. Hello?
Yeah,
Somebody's
still here.
Okay, so I think it was my sharing screen disappeared. That's okay, as long as you guys can see on here. All right, so the other things, 4G had a 20 megahertz wide OFDM carrier. You see that's right here. At FR2, we can go way bigger than that, like 400 megahertz wide component carriers, and you can have like 8 of those things piled up in a given band. So, you know, these are incredible amounts of bandwidth. If you're used to narrowband FM, it's, you know, the carrier spacing on these OFDM carriers is 15 kilohertz, but then there's thousands of them in the carrier. So we'll look at that. Subcarrier spacing back in 4G was fixed at 15 kilohertz. We'll see what that means in OFDM. But now in 5G, they've got what they call mixed numerology. So depending on what you're trying to achieve and optimize for whatever the intended service is, you can change that spacing. And particularly when you've got hundreds of megahertz of channel bandwidth, you don't have to suffer the penalties of having all your carriers crammed together. All right, and then the rest of this, you know, I did send Bruce, and I think it's on the web page. There's a book that Keysight put out, which is kind of like all this stuff, so we don't have to spend our whole night on these slides. I would like to jump over to a paper on OFDM. Everybody see that? Somebody say yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So why do we want to go to something different than, say, code division multiple access, which had all the fanfare back in the 90s and made the Qualcomm stock owners very rich, as did Dr. Viterbi and Dr. Jacobs? Why do we want to do something different? Well, there are several reasons. And I will say that CDMA bought you some of this improvement, but OFDM took it to the next level by 2 orders of magnitude. So why do we want OFDM? Well, it efficiently deals with multipath fading. Now, you know, multipath fading is what causes the Rayleigh fading and the picket fencing on narrowband FM. It's not your buddy, not in that case, because essentially multipath fading puts a notch filter on your channel. And if you're a moving target, it might sweep a notch filter through the channels and therefore cause a picket fencing as you're moving down the highway. Another advantage of OFDM is it handles channel delay spread better, which means that in the time domain, the spreading of these carriers, they start to decorrelate. That actually works to your advantage with MIMO, which is another subject. We're going to talk about OFDM here, and we're going to talk about MIMO next. Gives you enhanced channel capacity. So channel capacity these days, the holy grail, is bits per second per hertz of bandwidth per cubic meter of space. So how many bits per second can I deliver per hertz of bandwidth that I've consumed or been allocated to me per meter of space? So space division is the last division in reality that we have to play with. And we play with all of these domains to optimize letting everybody stream 4K TV while they're sitting there ignoring each other in the living room. We can adaptively modify the modulation density. We'll see that. So there's been a lot of adaptive modulation encoding going on in 2G and 3G. It's taking to its limit in 4 and 5G. As I said, it's robust against narrowband interference, of which multipath fading is the primary cause. And it is the only practical modulation scheme to use MIMO, which is multi-in, multi-out. And we're going to study that as a topic here in a second. So how do we create this stuff? OFDM, again, means orthogonal frequency division, multiple access or multiplexing. And the concept is that each of these is a signal that could in turn have on it BPSK, QPSK, QAM, you know, any kind of modulation scheme. So they're shown as sine waves, but these could be complex sine waves carrying, you know, FM, multi-level FM, continuous phase modulation, any of these sorts of modulation schemes. You're used to having these as single carrier modulation. So through the old satellites, the old 40 megahertz bent pipe C-band satellites that carried television for years. They eventually moved off to wideband FM onto QAM, like 256 symbol QAM. But there are many, I mean, modulation schemes, there are telephone books of them. So the point is that each of these sine waves could be, in this case, shown as a sine wave, but it could actually be a modulated sine wave, and that modulation could change its order to, you know, low order or high order as dictated by the channel, the instantaneous channel, you know, this time slot, which is 500 microseconds, as we'll see. Anyway, so this is what it looks like on a scope, and this is 2 channels worth on a scope. And in the impulse spectrum of any one of those, you will have this particular impulse response. And these are discrete time systems. They're not continuous. So every time symbol clock happens, a symbol will be generated and cause an impulse in the time domain. And you'll notice you have your sync function, your sine XOX over X side lobes. That's for one of the sine waves. And here's what happens with 4 of those sine waves. And what we've done is park the center frequency of any particular carrier in the OFDM carrier writ large or on a whole into the nulls of its adjacent brothers. So this is the orthogonality aspect, and that's why they call it orthogonal multiplexing. And this is not to be confused with orthogonal codes back in the code division. Those were orthogonal numeric sequences. This is orthogonal in the frequency domain. Now, we're showing 4 carriers here, but in reality, with 15 kilohertz spacing on these things, on a 10 meg carrier, there are thousands of these carriers. Each one of these carriers can be carrying a different modulation scheme. Each one of these carriers can be time assigned temporarily to you as a resource block. Usually they're handed out in blocks, not in singles. And that's a matter of system choice. But the concept carries on that basically OFDM is something like this, but thousands of them left and right, upwards of 10, 20, 30, up to 400 megahertz wide. To make that point real quick, let me jump over to this. Everybody see that one? Say yes.
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 Okay. All right, this is a vector signal analyzer, which is basically a spectrum analyzer that does vector measurements instead of just spectrum. And you see down here, we're playing a signal, which is an LTE-A FDD downlink signal with 5 megahertz wide interband carrier aggregated signals. So even back in 4G, they knew that they wanted to have more available bandwidth to hand out to the users. And the maximum was 20 megahertz wide, and it was all dependent on who owned what. So, you know, Verizon, AT&T, they all battled it out to buy the 800 meg band, the 1900 meg band, the 700 meg band. They're, you know, that's why the FCC, shall we say, repacks the TV channels down in the 700, 600 meg band. That's also why they paid huge amounts of money for the millimeter bands and displaced military users and incumbents that were there. Anyway, down here you see this is a spectrum analysis. This is a 5 megahertz wide carrier, a second component carrier, and these are centered at 800 megahertz. And over here in this spectrum, we have another 5 megahertz wide carrier at 2.15 gigahertz. Now, I'm not going to bring up any more of these playbacks, but essentially you could imagine this thing could be up to 400 megahertz wide and located up at 50 gigahertz if you had the hardware, if you had the spectrum, if you had the phone, if you had the access point, which is like a router to do it. Also notice that in these, this is just kind of scalar spectrum. This is what you might see on an old swept tube scalar spectrum analyzer, or something more recent like a real-time spectrum analyzer. Up here, you see the IQ space for component carrier 0, component carrier 1, component carrier 2. So this is what the IQ space looks like. And over here, you see this one's carrying 64 QAM, a lot of it. This is an aggregate picture, so it has sync, it has broadcast channels, it has reference signals. They're all colorized here in these demodulations, but you see up here the colors match what we've shown here. So this is kind of the state of what you have to do. Spectrum analysis has long left the old swept tune analyzers that we all know and love. And even your $100 spectrum analyzers out of China these days are basically vector signal analyzers like this, but they don't have these demods. Okay, just wanted to show you that. Another interesting thing to look at would be how this stuff is generated. So this is a application that is used to generate arbitrary waveforms to download into a wideband arbitrary waveform generator to create signals like we just looked at. And of note, across time here, we have 0 to 19 slots. The basic time frame structure in almost all cellular these days is 10 milliseconds. In other words, everything in the frame structure repeats after 10 milliseconds. The frame is cut down into 10 frames of 1 millisecond, and each frame is cut in half into slots. And here, just like we might have seen over on the vector signal analyzer, you can see that on this axis, we have what's known as resource blocks. Those are groups of those OFDM carriers. They're not handed out in individual carriers. They're handled out in resource blocks of about, I think it's 15 carriers at a block. And then versus time, we see sync stuff happening in the yellow bars, and we see general user stuff happening in the red bars. And down here, you see synchronization, primary and secondary synchronization blocks. These are the fundamentals that a receiver in the cell phone starts to look at once it's figured that, oh, I think I see a signal on the channel that me as a Verizon user are allowed to use. So it goes here first to look at the broadcast channel, says, yep, that's Verizon. It starts to sync up on these primary and secondary sync blocks. After that, there's a whole bunch of attachment processes that happen, negotiation, like, are you actually one of my people? And do you have you paid your bill? And do you have any authentication restrictions, priority restrictions, and so forth? You know, that's a whole nother subject that you could spend a month on, so we won't. But I just wanted to show you the time domain picture of how this stuff plays out. And by the time you get over to here, you come back over to here. So the base station is continuously playing out some version of this. And on a live signal, all this stuff would be fluttering like Christmas tree lights, because this is a static scenario. On a real base station with live traffic and 100 or 200 users, you know, the sync blocks will stay the same, but all the stuff in red will be dynamically allocated slot by slot. All right, enough of that. Let's see. So essentially the way this stuff is created is in the time domain, and we use an F inverse Fourier transform, a discrete Fourier transform, because this is all discrete time. I think that's going to be way too much to go into, and I'm about to just leave this slide set behind. Maybe this is worthwhile. Here's a case of a lot of these orthogonal carriers, but inserted at various intervals are pilot carriers that have known properties and help the demodulator in the phone, you know, keep itself centered up on the channel, basically. Let's just leave it at that. All right. And this goes back to 802.11. So we will say that OFDM came into Wi-Fi back quite a while ago, like 15 years ago. It only made it into cellular 4G at 2010. And of course, it's alive and well and will remain so. All right. The other topic I wanted to touch on that you know, and I think that'll be about enough for tonight because this could go on and on and on. And you can see this is an old Agilent paper. You know, I started working for Hewlett Packard in the 80s. We became split up as Agilent with all the test and measurement stuff, and HP went off in Y2K, and we were Agilent until 2015 or 2014 when we were spin off again as Keysight. Anyway, what we want to talk about here is MIMO, and this is generally applicable stuff. It was used and is used in Wi-Fi. It actually, MIMO could be used to represent old school receive diversity, transmit diversity that was used back 50 years ago. But in general, we're using a more exotic form of MIMO these days. Scrolling down through this paper. So let's just talk about the basics. MIMO means multiple input, multiple output. And don't be confused about this is the base station and this is the mobile, because there's a symmetric pair of this from the mobile's perspective back to the base station. So the transmitters are on the left and the receivers are on the right. SISO is what we do with narrowband FM, you know, single transmitter, single receiver. SIMO is single transmit and multiple receive antennas. Keep in mind, this is all on the same frequency, not on frequency division. Then there's the two more complicated, the multiple input, single output, meaning two transmitters still on the same frequency. And the simplistic case is basically transmit diversity, where it's not only the same frequency, but the same signal, and those propagating through the air to the receiver. And then the general 2x2 case of MIMO, which is two transmitters, two receivers, two antennas in each case. They may or may not be the same signal on both antenna. And that's where MIMO really starts to take off, as we'll see. So MIMO begins to open up what's known as the space-time multiplexing, which actually can statistically deliver a lot more than we're used to with our FM radios and with other technologies. Let's see here. All right, so let's look at a MIMO channel. This is a 2x2 channel model. You got your transmitter over here, be it the same signal or perhaps two different signals. We'll get to that later. And the outputs over at the receiver side. And then these are just models of the air, you know, through the air signal, both the direct path and the cross-coupled path. And these models could be static. They could just be, you know, 2 dB loss and 5 dB loss, could be some gain. But more likely, these are time functions that vary because you're driving down the street and the base station over here is sitting still, but you're in over here on these receivers on your cell phone and you're moving. So therefore, these vectors, if you will, are time functions themselves. We go back to the classic, this is Claude Shannon of Bell Labs fame, I think in 1952 or 3. And he came up with the thing known as the Shannon Channel Capacity Limit Theorem, which is essentially based on the signal to noise in the channel and how much bandwidth the channel has. But here we have the expanded version of Shannon, which takes into the account that there might be multiple channels and a matrix between those channels. And essentially, SISO gives you basically a flat performance dropping from good to poor based on the carrier to noise ratio. Yet MIMO, and we're talking about a 2x2 MIMO here, but keep in mind current MIMO is 4x2, 8x8. You might hear the term massive MIMO. That's where these antennas up on the cell towers are not antennas anymore. They are 64 element, 128 element, 256 element transmit receive modules like the phased array radars of the 80s, but now they're being used to do cellular telecommunication, and they are dynamically used, not statically. So on these new panels that are up on the tower, and you usually see at least 4 of them per sector, 3 sectors on a tower. Each one of those panels, if you took the radome off of it, would look like a phased array radar underneath, not a bunch of collinears or dipoles or whatever they used to be. And each one of those transmit receive modules has its own antenna, has its own modulator, has its own RF power amplifier, and they can be dynamically, as in on a slot basis, reconfigured to do what we know as MIMO or beamforming. You can't do MIMO and beamforming with the same resource at the same time, but you can do them both on a time assigned basis. So, like I said, 5G's gotten pretty exotic. You don't want to see all this stuff. Here's kind of something worth looking at. So here we have what they call an E-node B. That's another name for a base station in 4G. And I want to get across the point that we talked about an antenna here up on the tower, or a transmitting element up on the tower, and a second one. So we're a 2x2 here. And you see that from any one of these antennas to any one of these receivers, because of the multipath and because you're in a mobile environment, these propagations will change. You'll have hard reflections, you'll have airplane reflections, the urban canyon, you know, like downtown, have all these various rays of propagation that come and go. Now consider if we were transmitting the same information. Here we're showing 2 different sets of information, but if we were just doing one set of information to both of these antennas, the same signal, then, you know, we're possibly going to benefit from transmit diversity over here on the far end. But what if, instead of transmitting the same signal on the same frequency, we're going to do different layers or different streams, a lot of people call them, of data. One stream on this side, one stream on that side. It turns out that it's quite the benefit if these channels decorrelate. In fact, it's optimum for MIMO for the channels to decorrelate such that you can statistically, in the perfect sense, if you did this with a known fading model, almost get 2x of the channel capacity that you would otherwise get on this frequency or this bank of frequencies. So that's where MIMO really starts to shine. It starts to give you a spatial augmentation of the given physical channel, but it does depend on decorrelation. It is most useful in the what I'll call macro cellular environment, meaning something like what we're used to for cell phone towers, and 1 kilometer, 5 kilometer, 30 kilometer, because that's where you get this opportunity for the decorrelation. As it turns out at FR2 at millimeter wave, this decorrelation of the channels doesn't really work for you. And indeed, at millimeter wave, often what you will see instead of MIMO is beamforming. Well, they use, like 8 or 10 or 100 of these channels, but they'll use them to form a beam-formed antenna and sweeping beam to go find you, the user, over on this side. So MIMO has its utilities. Beamforming was actually part of LTE 4G, and they did a little bit of it, particularly for the guy that was on the edge of the cell and the signal was falling apart for him. They would allocate some resources to him to do beamforming instead of MIMO and maybe hang on to the call a little longer, but it wasn't that prevalent. So, basically MIMO is a macrocellular technology and beamforming is more appropriate for FR2 and short range communication. We'll go one more step and then I'll take a break here because it's 8:30. You'll hear this term massive MIMO. So what do you do if you're in a football stadium with 80,000 people and they all want to watch the game on their phone instead of watching it with their eyeballs, or stream the video to somebody that's not there? You've got a massive data consumption problem. So massive MIMO attempts to address that by either right circular cylinders or something that looks like a disco ball of TR modules hanging from somewhere up in the cheap seats or, the light towers, trying to massive MIMO 80,000 people trying to use their phones at the same time. It's kind of crazy, but that's what massive MIMO is. Okay. I'm going to stop and ask for some questions because this could go on all night. Somebody moderate and wave your hands.
Explain
Anybody?
how that is even possible, because that's why I'm here.
Okay. I don't know. It scares the crap out of me. Yeah, I'll tell you why it's possible. Because I work in aerospace defense too. The market for this is huge. There's so much money floating around in here that stuff that normally you might say, oh God, that's just way too expensive to try. Well, you've got billions, not only the 6 billion people, but you saw that forecast for 2021, 28 billion devices connected to the network, including the refrigerator, the dog, the toilet, the cars. So there's people paying money, and we're all paying what, 30, 40, 50 bucks a month. If you're really cheap, you might be able to survive on $10 a month. I had a guy who taught me OFDM 10 or 15 years ago, and he said the same thing. He said, like, who's going to pay for all this? And I said to him right then, I said, well, we'll be stupid enough to pay for it. And you look at these new phones, these new Samsung S20 Galaxies and the latest iPhones, which are all running Snapdragon Qualcomm chipsets. They're running about $2,000 for the high-end phones with maybe $600 discounts. And for me, because I started before cell phones, I go, what? I could have a really nice ham transceiver for that kind of cash. So, yeah, there's no need for anybody to run out and buy a 5G phone because it's all marketing. It's, there's very big money in this and everybody knows it. That'd be the whole ecosystem, the chipset vendors, the phone integrators, the service providers, the streaming content people. Biggest market that I can think of, short of healthcare. And healthcare is in on it too, because they want to be able to do remote medicine, not have everybody sitting in the waiting room getting sick together. So how is it possible? Some of the smartest minds, the biggest chipset companies, the mathematicians, most of the guys I work with are double PhDs, and I'm not. I'm hanging on with my fingernails day by day. But here it is. Mike, here it is. I mean, it's here today, 5G. And you're not going to see this millimeter wave stuff except, all right, so Verizon, AT&T, probably Google, they will pretty soon have this millimeter stuff buried into the Wi-Fi access point optical network transceiver that they rent you for $10 a month or whatever it is. You know, I've always used my own cable modem. I cut a deal for Fios where I didn't have to pay for a monthly on the modem, but that was just part of the deal. But essentially this millimeter stuff will come online, may even be in, and in fact, we're testing this stuff now at Verizon Ashburn, Virginia, to, you know, what looks like, you know, a little tower or a Wi-Fi access point, the things we've all had. Well, it'll also have this, you know, millimeter wave on top of the Wi-Fi, on top of the optical network transceivers, and it's all in there. It's mass produced, of course, it's built in China. Most of the end integration is China, Asia Pacific somewhere. We'd like to have all that back here in the US. You know, I worked in the Ericsson plant in Lynchburg in the 90s, and we did some amazing things. We built production lines that made 1 million handsets a year. A new phone fell off the production line every 18 seconds. So we were doing something. But we hadn't basically finished all that in 2000. They tore it out and sent it to Mexico. And they didn't even get it put up in Mexico before it got shipped to the cheaper labor rates. And don't think that the labor rate is it, because basically the robotics and automation is going to null out any advantage on labor from communist labor to local labor. You know, high skill labor will rule the day.
Hey, is the secret in the sauce the fact that maybe, as I understand, they're going to have multiple nodes, so telephone poles, whatever.
Yeah.
They will have the bandwidth between those. Is that how it all works?
Yeah, so you remember we talked about sub 6 gigahertz versus FR2, the millimeter stuff. You got to kind of play in that sub 6 arena to travel any distance. The free space path loss eats you up, and the ability to do decorrelated MIMO channels goes away. So yeah, the yesteryear of cell towers being widely spaced, as they were in 1G, you know, they were 30 kilometer, maybe 50 kilometer cell sizes, radius. Now they're more typically kilometer, sub-kilometer, that kind of thing. And then when you think about FR2, it's in your house. It doesn't get out of your house. In fact, it can't even work unless the device in your hand, or whatever the device is, and the access point, again, looks like a Wi-Fi router, are beam sweeping, and they coincidentally find each other. The beam coming from the access point is saying, okay, I'm sweeping around at this rate, and if you saw me, hang on, I'll be right back around. And eventually they'll lock up. And if you're a user like with a handset, you start to move, there's part of protocol there to, you know, not lose the lock. But if somebody slams the metal door shut, it'll go away. So, you know, they've got it covered now. Like I said, they're working up at now proposing 300 gigahertz, now proposing to get away from terrestrial cellular service with all these low Earth orbit satellites. They're coming on every time Elon sends up a rocket for somebody, he dumps another 60 or 80 of his small sats overboard with it. It's the most incredible thing I've ever seen. So, you know, 5G really pertains to the current state of a cellular ecosystem, but just around the corner, and we have a whole system within Keysight that's approaching what they call non-terrestrial networks, space networks. That's coming on like a freight train too. So, you know, that'll fix us up for being in the sailboat 200 miles offshore, because right now all I've got is my ICOM 706. And that might help me actually, but it's not gonna let me get my weather maps and stream anything else. So, you know, it won't be another couple of years. I guess you've all picked up on how fast this is. It's exponentially accelerating, which is all just kind of hard to believe, but it's happening. And, you know, we'll probably all make another 10 years, everybody on this call. You won't believe what will happen in 10 years if we're all still here. So, anything else? Oh, here's one for you, Mike. There's a ATSC OFDM layer coming as an alternative to all this stuff that's out there at the Sesame Street site now.
Yeah.
I guess for you, it'll be a new modulator, but
Well, I bring up this for the TV stations and what he's speaking of ATSC 3.0, ATSC 1.0, they skipped 2.0 for TV. That is largely dependent on the polarization of the TV station providing the service. And just to back up, I hope many of you have heard of ATSC for TV. It was, we offered TV plus a little more, could be data, service. A lot of that has been dependent on, we're finding now, where the full potential of that, on the polarization of your antenna. So at the Sesame Street site, which is a master antenna, it's right now horizontal only. So that will require an investment of the broadcasters. And many times they're on a master antenna. If they're not, they can just change their polarization. And it's not just, are you horizontal or vertical? You can have a mix. You can have a percentage mix. So yeah, the more effective, what Brewer's speaking of is this could evolve into the TV stations offering service to the providers, and they can provide, it would be another topic for tonight, they can provide all kinds of data that we're seeing here, but from the TV station.
with a wider footprint.
Huh?
Oh, a broadcast footprint at 500 megahertz, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Bill and I had watched a couple of YouTube things where the scientists and the doctors were in front of Congress complaining about this because of the effects on the human body that this is going to have, especially with the increased towers.
Okay, I'll take a swing at that. So, and this is true for anything, the body has to take an RF signal, whether it's 60 hertz or 300 gigahertz, has to take that energy, convert it into heat. We're not into the ionizing radiation up at, ultraviolet and x-rays. So for it to be dangerous, you gotta basically put about, at least 10 milliwatts, a half a watt or a watt to start cooking tissue. They studied this a lot with cellular at 2 gigahertz, 3 gigahertz, specific absorption ratio, where basically they have a half of a human cut and they put E-field probes in there and they irradiate like a cell phone would and look for hot spots and the potential for heating tissue. And the eyeball is the most sensitive. Now we all know that 2.4 gigahertz, which happens to be there because there were leftover magnetrons from World War II, and that's where our microwave ovens are, that will heat. But in terms of fear factor, most of your microwave ovens leak more than these devices will ever emit. So unless you're, staring in the door of your microwave oven and you got a leaky microwave oven, you're going to do a lot more damage there than you will with these devices, because these things are running down in the low bands, maybe half a watt, maybe. They're usually like 27 dBm maximum. So this is not like standing in front of a 10 kilowatt, 100 kilowatt TV transmitter. It'll never be that way. In fact, power is an enemy when it comes to space division and optimizing users. The fact is the FCC and the rest of the ecosystem doesn't like FM broadcasting and TV broadcasting because they're the last big power broadcasters there are. They would rather decimate it all and move us all into something cellular, some of these technologies here. So I don't think the doctor in the operating theater has anything to worry about. And the potential for remote surgeries, remote consultations, remote patient monitoring far outweigh the potential for harming people. People get worried about, the 60 hertz power, that all that stuff goes right through your body. If you go back to your antenna theory, which I think they study in the amateur bands, for an antenna to be efficient, it has to be on the order of one of the wavelengths of the frequency. So it's not until you get up into these microwave frequencies that your body itself is an efficient antenna. It is, of course, true when you get up into the 100 gigahertz region, but again, the powers they use up there are quite small. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just more concerned about more towers around than the phone, than that type of thing.
Well, by the time that signal gets to your body, it's down at negative 80 dBm, neg 50. It's way down there. It's way below a milliwatt. So you don't have to worry about that. Not like a laser. A laser will eat you, but this stuff won't. So don't worry. I wouldn't worry, and I wouldn't give you a bomb steer.
All right, I trust you.
Yeah, they also, OSHA would get involved if there were.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
If there were a big violation, and then not only that, they're not going to be towers. More so, they're already talking about getting on building tops, power poles.
Or in your house.
Yeah, in your house, wherever on your property. Low power stuff.
Yeah, see, they've got their hands in your pocket for whatever your cable service is. And then they're going to put these access points in the modem that you're renting from them, which you get the benefit of, but maybe somebody outside your house gets the benefit too. So, there was always an argument about, well, who's paying the bill here? And if you look in your service contracts with Verizon and AT&T or any of these cable providers, you kind of signed your life away like you did when you signed up for Facebook. Any other questions?
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
Quick one. Why should Huawei be afraid of Open RAN?
Okay. Open RAN is essentially, for those that don't know what that means, most of the base stations have been delivered up till now from major providers like Nokia, Ericsson, Lucent, Alcatel. So when Verizon went to buy their base stations, the whole thing came from one provider. And this isn't just for Huawei. This would be true for any of the major players in base station sales. O-RAN intends to break up what is the aggregate of a base station, which has many constituent parts, into smaller parts that are deployable, saleable, and available from multiple users. So if you want to, you can buy your remote radio head, which is now nothing more than this thing up at the top of the tower. It has all the RF in it, and it gets fed baseband over fiber from down at the tower base. So the big old cell towers with the big old concrete shelters, all that's gone. There's something about the size of a refrigerator that's weatherized. What comes out of that is a O-RAN standard. It means Open Radio Access Network standard. It's fiber, could be a lot of fiber, and 48 volts up to the remote radio heads up the tower. So, essentially this was already breaking up, but there were quite a few, shall we say, major players that dominated the market. And of course, Huawei would like to dominate that market. So O-RAN was actually an industry consortium that started up to say, okay, we're going to have some competition in all these blocks that make up a base station. You got the power amplifier, the receivers, the demodulators, the baseband processors, all the stuff that communicates back to the core network, which we haven't touched tonight, and it's coming up on 9 o'clock. So O-RAN is basically an effort that the big players have begrudgingly decided they're not going to stop. And it gets down into all the constituent parts that used to be provided by one player. Used to be, you go to somebody like GT&E or Lucent, and you'd buy the whole thing, the cell shelter, the coax, the tower, you know, all the hardware, base stations back in 1G were rack upon rack upon rack, kind of like the Quantar repeaters that we got at the MRA. It was that kind of stuff. It's not like that anymore. It's all getting diced down, so there'll be competition. So that's probably why Huawei doesn't want it, because they didn't want the competition any more than the other big players did. And then you have to consider Huawei and its, shall we say, a relationship with the communist government of China. That's a whole nother ball of worms. Did that answer the question?
Wonderful. I like Linux.
Yeah, Linux is going to take over. Yeah, Linux has taken over. So,
All right, Brewer, can I ask you a quick question? I suspect you probably already answered it, but from an application standpoint,
yeah,
I'm down in Colonial Heights, and I have the distinct advantage of being in between two cell towers. I can literally walk a block and I will get 4 or 5 bars on my phone. Here at my house and in our neighborhood, we struggle for 1. Will this being broken up into more, I guess, towers, the way to look at it, is the reception going to get better or just live with it?
well, if you're talking about 4G, if your service providers, who are you on? Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile?
Yeah, Verizon. I'm Xfinity. I was with Verizon for years, and they kept saying when it was 3G, when they come out with 4G, they hope it was going to improve. And
yeah,
it
well,
didn't.
it doesn't happen. So they only invest where the squeaky wheel gets the grease,
right?
Where they're going to get more money. And if you moved off of, say, Verizon to Xfinity, Xfinity just buys service from the major carriers that have the towers out there. So
right,
it's not really new towers. So potentially things will get better, but as you sit right there, you might cut a cheaper deal. You do have to remember, in any macro cellular environment, you're competing with a whole bunch of other people that may have paid more per month. So they're going to start choking the bits per second you get, depending on what you've been paying.
Right.
And part of, if you look at is this slide still up? If you guys can still see my slide.
Yeah, slides up.
Okay, so that mission critical and machine communication, you know, there's part of the 5G, because there's like 7 or 8 vectors of what they could improve. One of them is to be sure that they don't lose, you know, ultra high reliability and low latency to the general masses, particularly during a disaster or emergency event. So, you know, what a particular user gets, regardless of how many bars you get, if you got 1 bar, that means you've got pretty much enough to handle all but the highest order modulation schemes. And from there on, it becomes how many people are competing for the bandwidth that fiber into that base station can deliver. It's not so much the signal strength. And of course, 5 bars is great. And that just means you can get to the highest order modulation schemes. But, you know, and we get this a lot. Our testers focus on how fast can this one device go if it got the whole cell tower's allocations, which never happens, just never happens. So, you know, we in our test equipment tend to focus on what everybody needs to test their devices, their chipsets, their fundamental technologies, but knowing that once we've proven this phone can do 10 gigabits per second, which is ridiculous, but that's what we're testing now, you'll never get 10 gigabits per second because the allocation, unless it's up on FR2. So FR2 millimeter in your house, they'll let you have all you can take. But for macro cellular, like you're talking about, towers down the street, that'll always be contending for all the people that want to, you know, get service, including the people that are paying, you know, fill up my phone card or fill up my phone, you know, the lowest tier ARPU, that's average revenue per user, which is the holy grail in the business. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I'm not that important. I understand. I got it.
There's another point I'd like to inject here.
Sure.
Your experience. So yeah, there is. It's a matter of great. You get all the bars. It doesn't matter. It's how many people are using the system, as Brewer just mentioned. Which with 5G might mean that there is more bandwidth. The other factor is that I'd recently learned after necessity is you might have a tower down the street like I do 1 mile away, but that tower is looking far above my neighborhood.
Looks over you, yeah.
Yeah, so you're actually, when you receive that signal, sometimes you'll notice that you'll have a low signal, then it's high, and you're like, oh, this is great. You'll go back and forth. Well, your phone does get to select between the two, and depending on the phone, as I've understood, and I don't know this for a fact, if you have an Android, you might be able to specify, I want to look at this one tower. But by design, that tower is looking really far out. So it's not even looking necessarily at you when you think it's just down the street. So I'm just pointing that out, and the fact that you're only as good as the kids that are up late at night or at other points of the day drawing data for what's the latest game that's come out? I forget. Anyway, but they use that to play their games even wirelessly. So there are a lot of factors in play.
Any other questions? And we'll wrap it up at 9 o'clock.
I have one.
Go ahead.
What is your thoughts on like the current stuff we have, 4G, and sometimes the cellular will depend on your plan. They'll say you only get so much, and then they'll kick you back to 2G. What do you think it will become obsolescence after the 5G comes in?
All right. Throttling back your data is what they'll do regardless of whether you're on 2G, 3G, 4G. And let's just take 2G out of the picture because that's basically gone except for very corner cases. So when you if you see your phone go back to 4G, that's not because you are being throttled off of 5G. It's because the 5G signal disappeared. And I still see that occasionally on the phone I have. It's an Apple, like a XR. It's rare because there's still a little bit of what they call 3G out there. AT&T was, wideband CDMA. Verizon was C2K. Verizon has pretty much whole hog ripped it all out. But there's still some places where, let's say, like, you guys know I've got the farm down there in Verina, and occasionally my phone will slip off on Verizon 3G. And I look at it and go, how is it doing that? Well, and that cell tower's 2 miles away. Shouldn't be doing that. But I go down there and I look at that tower and I say, oh, this stuff is pretty old. And since there's like, such a sparse population out there, they're not going to upgrade that. But, anywhere where there's a dense population, they have to, because when the user comes in and says, towers in my neighborhood and I can't get service and I'm going to leave if you don't do something about it, well, then they'll put a better, tower up and more layers, more MIMO, more channels. So don't think if you drop off, if your phone says 5G down to 4G, and you probably haven't seen that. You've probably seen 4G drop back to 3G, right? Something like that, or maybe even 2G. That doesn't necessarily mean you've not paid enough. It just means that there's not enough signal on the 4G carrier to maintain a link. So it will backdrop into whatever else it can find. All these phones, they get built generically, but they get provisioned at the factory. And, you can buy an unlocked phone, and then the unlocked phone will try to learn what it's supposed to do, what bands it's allowed and what channels it's allowed by the SIM card. The SIM card says, okay, I'm a Verizon SIM and these are the channel plans that you should be looking for. The phone will find out where it is from its GPS receiver or other network data, and act appropriately. So, you know, it's not a uniformly distributed cellular environment across this country for sure, as we all know. And it's never going to be that way, except for this possibility of the low Earth orbit satellites. That's really going to mix things up because, you know, iridium is out there, it's still out there, but this will be iridium on steroids, thousands of satellites. So you'll probably never be able to get away from Big Brother without a Faraday cage. Any more questions?
Well, Brewer, thank you. We really appreciate. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I can do another one of these because I know this was scattershot, and I started looking at what I was going to do, and I was like, oh my God, it's too much to cover. But, you know, we can come back and do another one of these papers and focus on one thing. Suffice to say, this is not ham radio, and I love narrowband FM. I've done D-Stars and DMR and Fusion, and we just bought these Fusion repeaters for the MRA repeater. But as a human, I don't like the MBE, IMBE, AMBI vocoder, even when it's got no packet loss. I don't like the sound of it. As a human, I can listen through picket fencing and the various challenges to a narrowband FM signal. So as far as I'm concerned, it'll never go away. But, you know, this exponential growth of cellular wireless, it'll never stop. It's for me, it's Skynet and the Terminator movies. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
I guess we'll go ahead and close the meeting then. If nobody else has anything else for tonight, I'll ask for a motion to go ahead and adjourn. Okay, Tom, anybody second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, good night, everybody.